Picture this: turquoise water sliding past deep green forest, the kind of lush silence that makes you feel like you're trespassing in nature's cathedral. This, long before anyone called it Suriname, was Suriname, a region threaded with rivers the indigenous Lokono, Arawak, and Kalinago, Carib, navigated for centuries. Their names for different river zones often meant simple things like place of swift water, place of cassava, or place where you better respect the river spirits unless you want problems. Functional, poetic, sensible. Basically, everything colonial reports were not. Geographically, we're on the northeastern shoulder of South America, tucked between Guyana and French Guiana, with the Atlantic staring directly at us as if waiting to start drama. The Dutch would one day call this part of the Guianas their tropical project, which is historians speak for somebody in Amsterdam wanted money and other people suffered for it. Cut to 1667, a Dutch officer writes that the colony is secured, which is adorable. Because the only things secured were the Europeans' misconceptions about who actually controlled the interior. Spoiler, not them. Now zoom out. See that ridge running along the rainforest? Yeah. That ridge has watched every empire try and fail to tame these forests, and it remembers the footsteps of the people who refused to be owned. In a moment, we're going to follow those footsteps into the birth of the Surinamese Maroon nations, the first enduring free black states in the Americas. Quiet beat. This land learned resistance early, and it never forgot. Before the Dutch, English, Spanish, or French spent a single minute arguing over Suriname like it was a prize parcel in a messy divorce, the Lokono, Arawak, and Kalinago, Carib, lived across these waterways with a full civilization that somehow functioned without monarchy, naval cannons, or corporate shareholders. Daily life ran on cassava bread, fishing cycles, kinship networks, and a working knowledge of the rainforest that would later make European soldiers cry into their soggy boots. Archaeological evidence from the lower Suriname River shows long-settled agricultural plots. Early Spanish visitors in the mid-1500s describe villages with great order. Translation: Europe found people who had their lives together. We get a glimpse of their world from fragments, pottery, surviving oral history, and colonial reports that somehow managed to be racist and impressed. A 1598 traveler noted that indigenous canoes moved across water with such skill that Europeans could not follow. Sir, that's not sorcery. That's competence. But the indigenous world was not static. Kalinago traders moved salt and cassava bread along the coast. Arawak communities maintained diplomatic zones along rivers, and forest spirits figured regularly into the cosmology, long before Christian missionaries tried to rebrand them as misunderstandings. The heat here was constant, the kind that made cloth stick to skin and turned European wool uniforms into portable saunas. Indigenous people wore lighter garments, understood shade, and knew which plants cooled fevers. Every practical choice was a lesson colonizers refused to learn. If this chapter teaches us anything, it's that the Caribbean wasn't sitting around waiting for Europe to show up with civilization. Civilization was already booked and busy, but Europe heard rumors of fresh land, and you know how empires get when they smell profit. By the early 1600s, the Dutch, English, and French were playing musical chairs across the Guianas. Everyone wanted a sugar colony. Nobody wanted to learn how the land worked. In 1651, English settlers led by Lord Willoughby established a small plantation base near modern-day Paramaribo. Indigenous leaders tolerated them, temporarily, because alliances were practical. But then the English imported enslaved Africans, and everything shifted. The colony grew, violence increased, and the land began to bruise under colonial ambition. Cue the Second Anglo-Dutch War from 1665 to 1667, where Europe fought over things Caribbean people didn't ask them to fight over. In February 1667, Dutch commander Abraham Crynson seized the colony with a small naval force. The Treaty of Breda later that year confirmed Suriname as Dutch territory, traded like a card in a game nobody else wanted to play. Imperial motive in one sentence. Sugar makes money, and they wanted that. Academic phrasing would call it commercial expansion through plantation development. Real phrasing, they grabbed it and started planning spreadsheets before the ink dried. Colonial records from 1668 already mention Africans escaping inland. The Dutch were baffled, writing that fugitives fled deep into forests where pursuit was impossible. Yes, because they understood the assignment. The coast smelled like salt and sweat. The interior smelled like rain and freedom. People made their choices accordingly. The colony wasn't 2 years old before resistance began. That's the timeline empire never advertises. Let's meet the people who turned escape into a new political reality. The first Africans brought to Suriname didn't wait for an organized rebellion. Running was resistance. Survival was rebellion. Culture was rebellion. Documentation from the 1680s shows Dutch patrols repeatedly failing to stop what they called Negroes living wild. These fugitives built the earliest Maroon communities along the upper Suriname, Saramacca, and Katanga rivers. Many were Akan, Ga, Yoruba, Congo, people who had survived wars, enslavement, and the Middle Passage, and were now determined not to survive plantation slavery. A Dutch report from 1685 complains that escapees knew the forest in ways that seemed supernatural. You can hear the fear between the lines. The Maroons were not devils. They were human beings rediscovering autonomy on land empire pretended it owned. Among the earliest documented leaders was a man the Dutch called Joli Coeur, who established settlements in the deep interior during the 1670s. Colonial authorities sent armed expeditions after him repeatedly. All failed. The forest swallowed soldiers whole while Maroons watched from ridges, drums echoing warnings through the canopy. These early communities formed the ancestral roots of what would become the Saramacca, Ndyuka, Aukan, Aluku, Boni, Matawai, Quinti, and Paramacca nations, each with its own leadership, kinship system, and political identity. They carried African religious practices inland, adapting them to new contexts. Ancestor veneration, protective rituals, and drum languages became tools of cultural survival. The sound of those drums carried for miles. Europeans heard threat. Maroons heard home. Even in its early form, Suriname's Maroon world was not hiding. It was forming nations. Those nations didn't just grow. They fought. And the Dutch wrote down every embarrassing defeat. By 1700, the Dutch had transformed the coast into a grid of sugar estates. Picture endless cane fields, boiling houses steaming like Hell's Kitchen, and enslaved Africans forced to work 16-hour days, all while Amsterdam's investors toasted themselves for their business genius. Plantation logs from 1715 show terrifying mortality rates. Nearly 20% of enslaved people died each year on some estates. The Dutch blamed tropical ailments. The enslaved blamed systems designed to extract maximum labor before death. Guess who was right? The rise of sugar also accelerated brutality. Punishments included the stocks, the whip, branding, or confinement in makeshift dungeons called dugouts. One enslaved man, recorded only as Kwasi, told a Moravian missionary in 1738 that the forest represented life while the plantation meant death. So they ran, in groups, in dozens. Sometimes entire work gangs vanished overnight. A 1722 plantation report from the Torrerica estate notes that 12 people disappeared during harvest, taking tools, a canoe, and dried cassava. The overseer wrote bitterly that they departed with premeditation and supplies. Resistance wasn't an event, it was a rhythm. The wet season made pursuit harder. Maroons timed escapes accordingly. The sound of the boiling house at night masked footsteps. Every structural element of plantation life contained potential for subversion. Sugar wealth was built on human destruction. But destruction always produces survivors who refuse their assigned fate. And those survivors built something stronger than the plantation: community. Deep inland, Maroon communities grew into organized societies with councils, warriors, spiritual leaders, and family compounds. These were not camps, they were states. The Saramacca established villages along the upper Suriname River, blending African languages into a new Creole tongue and practicing ancestor rites tied to both Akan and Congolese traditions. A Saramacca proverb recorded in 1747 declared that a people without a river is a people without memory. Water became archive. Meanwhile, the Nduka, Aukan, held territory in the Katanga region, already engaging in small armed clashes with Dutch patrols. Their leaders, figures like Grandman Sabaku in the early 18th century, coordinated defense, diplomacy, and raids with strategic precision. Villages were built on elevated ground near river bends, offering visibility and escape routes. Dutch officials were horrified. In 1732, Governor John Nepveux wrote that Maroons lived as a free nation, insolent and proud, and that colonial forces could not root them out. Translation: we're losing. Maroon children grew up learning forest navigation, weapon making, and the stories of how their grandparents won freedom. A 1740 Dutch report nervously noted that the Maroon population was increasing through both births and continued escapes. They weren't just surviving, they were growing. Humidity pressed down like a wet cloth. In the forest villages, smoke from cooking fires mingled with the scent of palm oil and roasting plantain. Life had texture, rhythm, autonomy. These communities weren't just running from slavery, they were building alternative worlds. And when the Dutch tried to crush those worlds, the first Maroon Wars erupted. By the mid-1700s, the plantation frontier had pushed too close to Maroon territory. The Maroons responded with raids on plantations to free family members, gather supplies, and send a clear message: no new plantations in our direction, respectfully. Documents describe raids during 1749 along the Katanga and Saramacca rivers. Dutch forces retaliated, but routinely got lost, ambushed, or outmaneuvered. A 1750 military diary complains that Maroon drums communicated across distances and that forest trails seemed to shift locations. Again, not magic, skill. Major conflicts erupted between 1757 and 1760, with the Nduka leading widespread resistance. The Dutch deployed hundreds of soldiers, including hired Amerindian trackers, yet victories were rare. Maroon fighters used river bends, forest density, and hit-and-run tactics that professional armies simply weren't trained for. Captain Ajako, an Nduka leader during this period, coordinated ambushes that left Dutch forces demoralized and depleted. A 1759 military report admitted that patrols lost men to invisible enemies who struck at dawn and vanished by midday. The weapons were simple: machetes, clubs, captured muskets. The strategy was sophisticated: never fight on Dutch terms, always control the terrain, strike when they're exhausted. European officers wrote bewildered letters home describing warfare that violated every tactical manual they'd studied. The forest floor absorbed blood quickly. Leaf litter covered tracks within hours. Nature collaborated with resistance. The first Maroon Wars taught Europe a difficult lesson. You can't conquer a rainforest with arrogance. Eventually, the Dutch realized fighting wasn't working. Time to negotiate. Which brings us to the first legal recognition of black sovereign nations in the Americas. Imagine the shock in Amsterdam. In 1760, the Dutch colonial government signed a treaty recognizing the Nduka Maroon nation as a free and autonomous people. Yes, in 1760, 113 years before the emancipation of enslaved people in Suriname. The treaty acknowledged Nduka authority under their grandman, paramount chief, established trade agreements, set boundaries, and required the Nduka to return new runaways. That last clause they frequently overlooked. An archival excerpt states that the Nduka shall live in peace under their own captain, and we shall not disturb their villages. That is not emancipation. That is a European military defeat politely disguised as paperwork. The treaty negotiations took place at the coast, with Nduka leaders arriving by canoe in full ceremonial dress. Dutch officials had expected supplicants. They got diplomats. The grandman spoke through interpreters, laying out terms with the confidence of someone who knew his people had already won the war. Oral history preserves details the documents miss. The Dutch offered gifts, which the Nduka accepted as tribute. Europeans thought they were giving charity. Africans knew they were receiving acknowledgement of power. The treaty created the first recognized black state in the Americas. Ink dried on paper while the forest continued its own record-keeping through story and song. But other Maroon nations were not covered by this agreement, and conflict was far from over. After another brutal decade of fighting, the Dutch signed a second landmark treaty in 1762, this time with the Saramacca. It recognized their sovereignty, guaranteed trade, and acknowledged their territorial rights along the upper Suriname River. The treaty even required annual gifts to the Saramacca, a diplomatic tradition rooted in African political custom, where material exchange signified respect between powers. Saramacca oral history recalls a leader, often identified as Captain Abini, who told Dutch envoys that while Europeans might write what they wished on paper, the Saramacca wrote with the river. The Dutch did not know how to respond to that level of poetry. The 1762 treaty contained clauses about boundaries, about returning runaways, about trade protocols. But the real text was unspoken. The Dutch could not win militarily, and the Saramacca would not submit. Everything else was just finding words for that reality. Colonial administrators in Paramaribo grumbled that the treaties set dangerous precedents. They were right. The precedent was that African people could fight European empires to a standstill and force recognition of their freedom. Two Maroon nations now had legal international status. Europe hated it, but they couldn't undo it without starting another war they'd already proven they couldn't win. Speaking of wars they couldn't win, here comes the Bony epic. If Suriname Maroon history had a blockbuster hero, it would be Bony, leader of the Aluku, Bony Maroons. Born on a plantation around 1730, escaped as a youth, and grew into a strategist whose military brain deserved its own textbook. The Bony Wars erupted in the 1760s and 1770s when Aluku fighters began launching raids that the Dutch described as unparalleled in boldness. Bony's stronghold, Fort Buku, sat on a ridge so well hidden that Dutch soldiers spent years trying to find it. only to walk in circles like confused tourists. A 1771 Dutch officer wrote that Bonnie's fighters vanished into the earth itself. No, sir, they simply used camouflage and terrain, things you would know if you listened to people outside Europe. Boney organized his forces with precision. Scouts monitored Dutch movements, supply lines ran through forest networks, and attacks were timed for maximum psychological impact. In 1772, a coordinated Dutch assault finally destroyed Fort Buku, but Boney escaped with most of his people, retreating eastward toward French Guiana. The Dutch thought that was the end. It was intermission. Boney regrouped in French territory, established new settlements, and continued resistance operations for 2 more decades. French colonial authorities tried to use him against the Dutch. Boney used the French for supplies while maintaining autonomy. A 1780 French report nervously noted that Boney answers to no European authority. He was killed in 1793 during a French-led ambush, betrayed by shifting colonial alliances. But the Aluku people survived, maintaining their independence and eventually signing their own treaties. The nation that bears his name, the Boney or Aluku Maroons, still exists today, still autonomous, still remembering. Boney proved Maroon warfare wasn't desperate rebellion. It was deliberate, tactical, and astonishingly effective. And Europe's confusion about Maroons wasn't limited to Suriname. Let's pan out to the wider Caribbean. Suriname wasn't fighting alone. The Caribbean was vibrating with resistance. In August 1791, the Haitian Revolution erupted and sent shockwaves across every plantation society. Dutch officials in Suriname panicked. One wrote in 1793 that authorities dreaded the contagion of French ideas. By French ideas, he meant freedom. Suriname's enslaved population communicated across plantations through markets, waterways, and kinship ties. Drums carried messages, stories traveled. Haiti showed what was possible: total revolution, a black republic, the defeat of 3 European armies. Earlier uprisings like Tacky's revolt in Jamaica during 1760 also circulated through oral networks. A Moravian missionary noted in Suriname in 1805 that enslaved people referenced the great fights in Jamaica. Information flowed through song, through subtle references in marketplaces, through the movement of sailors and domestic workers. Meanwhile, Maroon nations in Suriname strengthened their cultural practices, Winti religion, drum languages, and matrilineal kinship systems, as acts of defiant continuity. Every ritual was resistance. Every story was archive. Every child raised in freedom was victory. The spiritual life of these communities blended Akan, Congolese, and Fawn practices into new forms. Ancestor veneration became a way to maintain connection to both Africa and to those who died fighting for liberation. Water rituals honored river spirits who protected escapees. Forest shrines marked safe paths. The Caribbean wasn't a series of isolated rebellions. It was a continental conversation about freedom. But the biggest structural shift wasn't coming from Maroons. It was coming from abolition movements creeping toward Suriname like a slow, reluctant storm. The Netherlands abolished slavery in its colonies on July 1, 1863, but with a classic colonial twist. A 10-year state supervision period in which formerly enslaved people were forced to keep working for their former owners under government control. If emancipation were a subscription service, this was the part where you discover the hidden fees. Archival payrolls from 1864 show wages so low they barely functioned as currency. Many people left plantations as soon as supervision ended in 1873, moving to Paramaribo or establishing independent villages along rivers. Some sought refuge with Maroon relatives, reuniting families separated for generations. Colonial authorities complained that labor was unreliable. Translation: people preferred freedom to underpaid exploitation. Shocking. A woman named Aleida, interviewed by missionaries in 1875, explained that after supervision ended, she walked 3 days to reach Saramacca territory, where her grandmother had escaped decades earlier. She found cousins she'd never met, speaking a language that sounded like home and Africa mixed together. She stayed. The decade of forced labor left deep scars. People remembered that emancipation had come with conditions, with surveillance, with the plantation owners still holding power. Real freedom meant leaving entirely. Emancipation wasn't a gift. It was a battle half won. The other half would take generations. And when Africans finally left the fields, the Dutch imported new labor from very far away. To replace emancipated Africans, the Dutch imported indentured laborers from British India between 1873 and 1916, from Java between 1890 and 1939, and smaller numbers from China and Madeira. Contracts promised wages and land. Reality delivered surveillance, debt, and grueling work. Records from the Marienburg sugar estate show high suicide rates among indentured workers, many of whom wrote devastating testimonies in Hindi, Bhojpuri, and Javanese. One complaint from the 1880s stated plainly that workers had left famine only to find slavery. The ships brought people who carried their own histories of colonization. Indian workers brought Hindu and Muslim practices. Javanese laborers brought Kejawen traditions blending Islam and indigenous spirituality. These cultures didn't replace existing ones. They added layers to Suriname's already complex social landscape. Meanwhile, Maroon nations continued living in semi-autonomous regions. Leaders like the Saramacca Granman Agbago in the early 20th century negotiated land rights and maintained customary law despite colonial pressures. The treaties from the 1760s still functioned, still protected territorial sovereignty, still forced the Dutch to recognize Maroon authority. Suriname was becoming a multi-ethnic society under unequal conditions, a mosaic made by force, resilience, and negotiation. Paramaribo's streets mixed Shranang Tongo, Hindi, Javanese, Dutch, and Saramaccan. Markets sold roti and palm and cassava bread side by side. Every new wave of laborers entered a land already shaped by centuries of resistance, and that resistance would help fuel the movement toward nationhood. By the mid-20th century, workers' strikes, student movements, and political organizations were reshaping Suriname. Leaders like Anton de Kom exposed colonial brutality in his 1934 book, Wij Slaven van Suriname, We Slaves of Suriname. For telling the truth, the Dutch arrested and exiled him, proving his point. Post-war reforms created elected councils. By the 1950s, political parties representing Afro-Surinamese, Hindustani, Javanese, and Maroon communities were negotiating shared futures. It wasn't always smooth. Ethnic tensions flared, power sharing remained contested, but the conversation was happening. On November 25, 1975, Suriname became independent. The new flag lifted over Paramaribo while drums pounded through the streets. Rhythms older than colonialism, younger than freedom, stitched together by survival. Maroon nations today still hold distinct legal status under Surinamese law. The Saramacca, Ndyuka, Aluku, Matawai, Quinti, and Paramacca maintain cultural autonomy, traditional governance, and living languages that carry African roots into the present. The 1760 and 1762 treaties remain foundational documents, recognized by national and international law. Independence didn't erase the past, but it affirmed what Maroon history always taught. People will fight for the right to shape their own world. Picture a canoe gliding upriver at dusk, drum beats carrying across water the way they did in the 1700s. The forest leans close, listening. Every sound says the same thing. We are still here.